Hello, and welcome to the Tex Mix, brought to you by Texas Signal. I'm your host, Jessica Montoya Coggins. Today, I'm joined by Juan Martinez-Guevara, the Texas Advocacy Associate of United We Dream, and a DACA recipient. Hello, Juan.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks so much for having me here.
Thank you so much for being here. So today, we're talking about DACA, which June 15th is the 10th anniversary of this. And Juan, if I get something wrong, please do let me know because there is a very complicated history with this. So DACA was signed into law by President Obama 10 years ago. This happened when immigration reform was at an impasse, as it often is. There was a big bill that passed the Senate. Then Speaker of the House, John Boehner, did not put it up for a vote in the House, hence it lapsed. So Obama signed this into law, and this is the Deferred Action for Childhood. I am already messing up my words here. Deferred Action for Childhood.
Childhood arrivals.
Childhood arrivals. All right. So it's a temporary thing. It is something that is it is for a 2-year interval for work visas for really the children who are brought here as young immigrants. My understanding was this was always kind of meant to be a temporary thing, sort of a placeholder until there was federal legislation.
Yeah, that's correct. And actually, Obama passed it through executive order, which is why it wasn't able to, why it's often in the courts and on tenuous ground. And people argue, like always arguing over his power to do that. So you're totally right. It was limited in scope and it was pitched as a temporary solution. Yeah, hence why it's, always in the courts.
Well, yeah. So speaking of the courts, so where we are right now is DACA actually survived in the Supreme Court recently. There was a kind of narrow ruling, the 5-4 decision, that basically when the Trump administration was trying to undo this, 5-4 Supreme Court, this was when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still on the court. John Roberts ruled in that majority, not necessarily saying that it was legal-ish. He kind of basically said the way the Trump administration was trying to get rid of this was not right. So it stayed. Obviously, things have changed with that court's makeup. And there's currently a court case that was ruled recently within the last year by a judge in Texas, Andrew Hannon, who ruled DACA unlawful. Now, what that means currently, and please correct me if I'm wrong, current recipients of DACA can submit to that 2-year renewal. However, any new applications for this have been completely closed off.
Yes, correct. So this happened July 2021. And since then, it's only the people who are already in the program that get to continue filing for renewals. That is only until another court decision comes, right? So even then, the folks like me who are in the program, we're simply waiting for the next decision to come through, right? And oftentimes it's hard to think like, optimism, like, sure, everything will be okay when we've lived through this multiple times now in the past 10 years, right? I can count so many years where I've been waiting for a court decision to determine what I can do next. So despite it being the 10th anniversary of DACA, it definitely isn't a celebration. It's a continuation of the fight. And yeah, so it has also, this decision by this judge also blocked any of the thousands of other eligible youth from applying to the program, right? So there's a lot of other folks who can still qualify for this sort of relief, but since this decision was a partial ending of the program, they're blocked out while we await, on the future of that.
Yeah, so you're with an organization, United We Dream. At Texas Signal, we actually ran an op-ed from one of your colleagues, Aurelia Lozano, and she is someone who was trying to apply for that DACA, was not able to. So could you talk a little bit about United We Dream and what it does and how you became involved with that organization?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm currently the Texas Advocacy Coordinator for United We Dream. United We Dream is the largest immigrant youth-led network in the country. And, we advocate for the dignity and the respect of all immigrants, right? That includes doing advocacy on programs like DACA to preserve it, but also to push beyond DACA, and to really deliver for what immigrants deserve. I personally became involved with United We Dream as an immigrant youth advocate myself in 2017. 2017 was really a year where, there was the inauguration of a new administration. A lot of discussion preceded it on the planned end to DACA, right? So going into 2017, we knew to expect attacks on DACA. And so I became involved, definitely because I'm an immigrant myself who benefits from that. I am part of a family that needs immigration relief. I am part of a community here in Dallas that is very diverse, and a lot of folks are undocumented and are, amazing parts of our community. So definitely standing up for our communities here. And I know that our members, we're a member-led org. Our members are really the ones that hold it down. Like Aurelia, we have a lot of members that are, within DACA, but also a lot of members that don't have DACA, right? And beyond that, we have members who applied to this 10 years ago when maybe they were 18 years old and now they're 28, right? A lot of our members are now entering later stages of their life, having families. So it's a question of, how long are we going to have to keep this fight going when we're growing old and our membership is changing? Right. So we're member led, and it's really to do justice to the fact that, we really want to advocate for what our community deserves, and that's dignity. And that means protections for everyone. No one should be at threat of deportation or detention in cruel and unfit detention centers. So.
And also, my understanding is too with DACA is the way the application works. And this is something I think that there's been a lot of fear mongering on, particularly the Republican side, like, oh, criminals are doing this. There are a lot of hoops you go through, background checks. It is not there. It's a pretty rigorous process there.
Yes, it definitely is. And on top of this discussion of DACA being from the start discussed as a temporary solution, while Congress figured out its gridlock and create or legislated an actual solution. On top of that, DACA also has a lot of requirements, like you've mentioned, for the people who benefit from the program. So when I applied, I had to do a criminal background check, and I had to get all my documents in order to then request my permit, right? They have to be aware of anything that happens in your record. But on top of that, for a lot of people, there's a $595 fee for it, or it might be $495. It's around $500.
A lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. And for a lot of folks that are working, that is a substantial portion of their paycheck that has to be filed every 2 years. And that's on top of any lawyer fees that folks might need to contract out. You have to mail stuff in, and you have to be very hyper aware of the timelines, right? Because if you're not, punctual on saying like, by this date, my DACA needs to be filed, you then have questions of, will I be unemployed because there's a gap in my coverage, right? If you send it maybe 1 or 2 weeks later. If there are processing delays within USCIS, which is often the case, then you would then have to prepare to tell your employer, hey, there's a gap in my employment authorization document. So on top of it being a temporary solution, it presents a lot of hurdles for people who benefit from the program, that would be resolved through an actual legislative solution to an issue like this.
Mm-hmm. That happened. The friend that we were talking about earlier before we started recording, he was a teacher at DISD, and there was a processing error, nothing of his fault, but something didn't get worked out, and he had to stop teaching. And by all accounts, he was a wonderful teacher. And we know and I think right now there are, 20,000 eligible teachers we have in this country who, with this DACA status.
Mm-hmm.
And we know right now that there are so many gaps in many school districts because of the attacks on teachers for other reasons.
Yeah. And that's not an uncommon story at all. I also have a cousin that was a teacher at DISD, and also had to temporarily leave her job due to a gap in coverage. And that impacts her, right? Because that was what brought her, happiness and passion into her life, but also her students that then were told, your teacher, your teaching assistant might come back, might not come back, we'll work it out, but definitely not an uncommon story. Yeah.
No, yeah. So right now things are in a very unsettling place. However, Democrats do hold this large majority, not necessarily on the judicial side, but at least, they have the presidency and they do technically have both chambers of Congress. Um, what would you like to see happen on the federal level, especially because we are in Texas, where I think on the state level, we're not going to see any sort of protections here?
Yeah, that's right. So definitely one of our calls last year, as I'm sure you knew, was the effort through the reconciliation package. That was really an effort where Democrats could have used a 50-51 vote strategy within the Senate, which is really the chamber in question, that would have passed this, right? So we're always looking for legislative protections and for protections to be passed, not just for DACA, but for all undocumented individuals. There are approximately 11 million people who are out of status and who need a solution, right? You're right, the presidency, Democrats do hold the presidency and both chambers of the legislative branch, which means they can totally legislate DACA into law, but also legislate protections for all undocumented folks, right? So what we're really calling on is for Democrats to take on the Democrats and politicians in general, right? Like this doesn't just fall on Democrats, but definitely for Democrats that have the power to take on the political will and courage to pass this, regardless of what, whatever theatrical political theater concerns they might have. This needs to be done. And they need to pass a package that includes everyone, not just DACA folks, not just the youth.
That's a great point. We are talking about DACA, but again, this was sort of like in my opinion, sort of something that President Obama did. That was kind of a placehold. That it was just like, all right, and there was actually a court decision on DAPA, for the parents of children brought to this country. It was decided at the Supreme Court in 2016. This was after Anthony Scalia died, and they had that weird sort of 4-4 court, and it got brought down to the Fifth Circuit, which is incredibly hostile on these things. But you brought up this good point about there's this huge will to do this and the need to do this, and there's a huge moral component on this. But there's also a huge economic component. I mean, the revenue that would be generated by folks having this legal pathway to citizenship is instrumental. And this is actually one of the reasons that many large corporations, which, they might have dubious reasons for doing this, but they actually are for this because they know it will do well for the economy. The last 2 years in this pandemic, a lot of the essential workers in this country were immigrants or folks that were undocumented, actually, I should say. And if that pathway had existed, where would we be? So how does that sort of make you feel that, for undocumented immigrants, they are an essential component of our country, yet they live in this shadow existence, even though they do pay taxes?
Yeah, so definitely there is a huge economic case to make for a pathway to citizenship, not just for DACA. And I think a lot of the, politicians who like to say, we're on the center on this issue, do that as a way to justify passing and legislating protections into law. But I think what I like to focus on and what I like to bring back to the center is that, as immigrants, we deserve permanent protections regardless of the economic component. Our lives are here and our home is here in this country, right? And I think that's reason enough. We deserve dignity, and it shouldn't be reduced to our labor or our output, to justify why we deserve to stay here and hold on to the lives we've built here, right? So I always like to reframe it and say, maybe there's an economic case to make, but at the bottom line, the moral case is really the ultimate and that's the bottom line. The moral case is that, we deserve to be here. We have built our lives here, and just as you wouldn't personally take someone's life away from them, right? We have to recognize that this is being done the longer we hold off on passing legislation, right? Family separation is happening all over. Communities are being torn apart through deportation, right? When you deport members of families, then you leave those families broken. And that is not something that you would personally do to someone. That is the reason why we cannot hold off on passing this legislation. That's functionally what is happening by holding off and inaction, right? Families are being torn, and people are not being treated with the dignity and respect that they deserve.
That's, I think, a very poignant way of framing that, particularly for a lot of the politicians that claim to be of a religious persuasion,
Yeah.
who will turn around and say some of the most demoralizing things about people in their own communities.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it definitely centers the fact that, all over immigrants are facing different forms of harm, right? Whether it be at the border, they're in cruel detention centers, even when they're seeking asylum and seeking protection from, violence they faced in their own country.
There's a legal right in that's a legal right.
Exactly. It's a legal right. It's a legal process that, is really being attacked. And now not just by politicians who are speaking, but like by the court system, right? And by like policies that are being enacted, but also internally in the country, people are being persecuted. And when you think about it, like who are the immigrants that are being persecuted? Oftentimes, it is the Black and brown immigrants who are the ones that have ICE knocking on their door, right? So it's also a racial issue. And I think for people who are, who are come from a religious background, you can definitely see, and, I would ask that people really see the way this harms people, right? Like at the bottom line, it is a harm. Whatever debate you want to have over laws and like the legal system, we can acknowledge that historically laws have had to change in order to align with the moral consensus, right? And I think that this is an issue in which that is also true, right? So many images come up from people facing deportation, people facing detention at the border, abuse at the hands of ICE and CBP, right? And I think those images really ground the fact that at the end of the day, we're people that deserve dignity and respect, and we need to legislate those protections, right? To protect folks that are in need of that safety and security.
Yeah, as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about a lot of the outpouring of support for refugees from Ukraine. And we want to help those folks and families as much as possible and extend our arms. But there was also a lot of talk about, a lot of that same sympathy was not extended to folks from, let's say, Central America or Haiti or other places. And I should also say that, immigration tends to get placed as sort of a Latino or Hispanic issue. And that is absolutely not the case. There are many, many folks embroiled in our immigration system from every single continent. Maybe with the exception of Antarctica. I don't think we do that. But no, it's worldwide on that. So that is something I've been very cognizant of.
Yeah, and you're totally right on that. I think definitely like folks who are fleeing from violence deserve to be heard and deserve to be aided in that. And I think that was one of the things that came up for so many people was, there was such quick movement to address and the outpour of support for Ukrainian refugees, which, don't get me wrong, that is we always want to help refugees and people who are seeking asylum, but at the same time it is a stark contrast with the people who have been advocating for the same protections for Black and brown immigrants that has been fought for decades now, and Congress has simply not come to a solution, when right now there is the power and the ability to simply legislate it, right? Again, Democrats hold the chambers and the presidency. This could be passed, but there's just not that same brevity and like the quick support behind it, right? And it brings into question, what is the root of that, right? And just the images that come out, right? Immigration is a racial issue in a lot of ways. It is not a Latino issue by any means, but a lot of Black and brown immigrants are facing a very different approach, right, than the refugees from Ukraine were facing or were receiving. So yeah, you're totally right on that. And I think that's something that the movement, really, it took that the movement really saw and was like, wait, there's a disconnect here.
So you currently reside in Texas, and you're also no stranger to Texas Signal. You actually penned an op-ed for us. This was sort of about Greg Abbott's misplaced priorities. As we all have kind of seen these last couple of years, they have not protected the grid. There's been no movement on gun legislation, gun safety legislation, even after the horrific tragedy at Uvalde. No sense that there will be a special legislation. You've seen sort of the priorities that they have done, voter suppression, anti-trans laws, obviously, pretty much wiping away abortion rights, as well as demonizing immigrants. That has been, I think, a huge thing that Abbott has pursued through Operation Lone Star. I guess, could you sort of talk a little bit about that? And because I think you wrote for us a couple months ago, anything changed, or has it pretty much stayed the same?
I think a lot of people would say, and I agree, right? Like, it has stayed the same. And I think this isn't something new. It's gone back in 2021. We had this awful freeze happen, right? And many people thought, maybe this is a point in which they heed the calls of the public, since it's such a non-issue, right, for the public. But as I read in the op-ed, right, there has been this calculated political effort to use vulnerable populations, right? Immigrants being one of them, and not just immigrants, but the LGBTQ community, voters, right? Low-income folks. There's a calculated effort to focus on, attacking these vulnerable communities and framing them as the issue, right? So much time has been spent on talking about, immigration and attacking immigrants, to the point where then you remember nothing has been done on the grid, right? So in an effort to pursue this political theater and score these cheap political points, costing immigrants their safety in the streets, right? Costing immigrants their dignity and the respect they deserve. It also affects all Texans, because it goes back, and this year we had another freeze that maybe wasn't in the same scale, right? But people still lost power. Mm-hmm. People were still in their houses without electricity, in the cold. And that's something that, it has to be seen for what it is, which is it's political theater. It's an effort to distract and scapegoat, when really Greg Abbott is failing the state. And it's not just on the power grid, it's on climate, it's on voting rights issues, on so many issues that are actually popular policies. Mm-hmm. No movement has happened, right? But there's all these unpopular policies that are proven to be unpopular that have been legislated because this minority holds so much power in our state legislature.
Yeah, no, speaking of like power going out, we're on the opposite end of the spectrum now from winter and the summertime, almost a 100-degree difference.
Yeah.
And there's parts of North Texas that have lost power. And I did like in your op-ed, you noted how Greg Abbott, very much after that winter storm, sort of pivoted to attacking the Green New Deal, which there is no Green New Deal. We don't have that in Texas. There's no, in fact, the wind and solar were actually what sort of have kept a lot of plants going.
No, yeah. And recently that's what's come up, right? Like, totally agree. In the winter, we have this issue. In the summer, we're having this issue. And now they're saying solar and wind power, really the ones that have kept us safe when there's been any question that we might lose our power. And still there's this discussion on the Green New Deal, which isn't even moving through Congress.
Yeah, I think he's
Right.
had one Senate hearing. That's it. That's it.
Yeah, exactly.
So just speaking of Greg Abbott, so we noted that right now is the 10th anniversary of DACA, but it's also the 40th anniversary of a landmark Supreme Court case, Plyler v. Doe. This was a case that it was against Texas, actually. And it basically ruled that every single child, regardless of their immigration status, deserves access to free public education. A couple months ago, Greg Abbott floated, he kind of wants this decision to get reversed, and knowing sort of what the legal system looks like in Texas, and the fact that Ken Paxton, our indicted attorney general, led the forefront against DACA, and we are under the Fifth Circuit, which is extremely right wing.
Mhm.
What did you make of when he said that?
Yeah. So the first, when I saw that, it was a sense of panic, right? To think that, and this was just following the court case that was filed against UNT, presenting a threat to in-state tuition for college students, right? So immediately it was a sense of panic to think that, that is something that I personally benefited from. That is something that I know other kids in my community have benefited from, right? The ability to pursue an education regardless of their citizenship status. So it was one of panic, right? Thinking that a basic right would be taken away from a large portion of the population. But, upon looking at the comments, right, like there were some glaring inaccuracies and just misleading comments that he made, such as saying that the case was brought on by Texas rather than against Texas, right? So ultimately, I think that, this was a comment that he kind of just was like, oh, I can make a moment out of this. I can make like a sound bite, and I know that, my base will like to hear this, right? So I think it was definitely made in that vein. I don't want, obviously still should be focused on it and like pay attention, right? Because we're in a time where a lot of rights are being threatened and being restricted. So definitely don't want to take it lightly, but I think it just speaks to the fact that Greg Abbott likes to, in times of doubt, simply attack a community to draw attention away from himself and kind of, channel this energy against another group. And this time, unfortunately, it was children who are just wanting to get an education, like K through 12 education, go to elementary school. These are the kids that he's really focusing on attacking, as a way to say, don't look at what I'm doing, let's attack these children. So yeah, it's very scary, but and definitely I think our community should stay active and like aware, because we cannot take more restrictions to education when it's already so expensive, right, for all people in the country.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I know Maldef was very, because the Mexican American Legal Defense Educational Fund, I think they way 40 years ago were sort of the people who helped argue that case. They sort of were like, all right, we're paying attention. However, we recognize, as you were saying, Abbott's a craven politician, and he was on a right-wing talk show, and
Of
he
course,
knows
yeah.
his audience. He knows the base
Yeah.
he has catered to, has had to
Mhm.
cater to win in our Republican primaries.
Yeah. No, and I think definitely it was right, again, catering to an audience. I think we have seen Texas take a very like right-wing lurch, right? Living in the state, Texas has always been conservative, right? But I think recently it's been very nationally leading like the news on some of these attacks against some of the most vulnerable folks. So yeah, I definitely see that. And I know that Maldef, they said like we were on this case 40 years ago, and we can't believe we have to still be defending something that is long established law in this country. Yeah.
There's some very famous signage that exists from all these protests that we go to. Basically an older woman or man pulls up a sign. It's like, I can't believe I still have to protest this
Yeah.
BS. And
Huh.
that's very much, that's the Texas story.
Yeah. No, exactly.
All right. So what sort of takeaway messages for folks who do want to see immigration reform passed? Are there things that they can do to make sure this happens for folks like yourself and millions around the country? How do we get this actual pathway to citizenship passed?
Yeah, so I think, it starts by people recognizing that, we're on this 10th anniversary of DACA, but it's not really a celebration. Rather, it is a continuation of the fight, right? Again, thousands of people who could be eligible for the program are blocked from accessing the program. Beyond that, people who are in the program, like myself, are constantly under, awaiting court decisions. And then beyond that, we still have parents, siblings, cousins, community members who are also undocumented, who won't even fit in the program, and any day could face deportation and like separation from their family and their community. So definitely today is a way for us to remember that the fight continues. We haven't resolved it. DACA is not a solution. It was a band-aid. But also remember that DACA was won through the relentless organizing by young people of color, right? So DACA wasn't just something that was given freely. It was something that was fought and won. And just like that was fought and won, we must continue fighting to win protections for not just for DACA, but for all 11 million undocumented people in this country. We need to make sure we secure everyone's fundamental human rights to live safely in their communities, to live freely, with dignity, with respect, and to treat them with humanity, right? So I think what we need to focus on now is there is the political ability, even though people will say there's gridlock and will, wave it as like, oh, Congress always acts like this. We have to question, right, why we're so complacent with just allowing a Congress that doesn't legislate for the people. But then on top of that, recognize that, the Democrats do hold power over the presidency, the Senate, and the House, right? If they are the party of the values they say they are, there's no reason why DACA cannot be passed and legislated into law as soon as possible, right? So people need to remember to keep adding pressure and to demand from politicians, right? We're not just here to vote for politicians every few years. We're here to demand that they take action and to hold them accountable for their promises, right? So yeah, I think definitely we all need to come together in this fight to make sure that we're demanding dignity and simply humanity for everyone.
That's a very great message. We support our allies, but we also want to hold them accountable.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So my thanks to Juan Martinez-Guevara from United We Dream. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for everyone for listening. We're at Texas Signal. We're on all the social media channels. And if you are so inclined to support progressive media, we're on Patreon. So thank you so much to all of our patrons who support us in that capacity. And again, we will chat soon. Bye, guys.
Thank you.